So rather than run away from run away from artificial intelligence, like the way I look at it is, how can you harness it and use it to benefit your members and also to build power for the union?
Welcome back to Union Base, the show where we explore the critical intersections of technology, labor, and the future of work. Today we have an incredible guest, someone whose expertise and insights are shaping the way we think about labor in the age of artificial intelligence. Alvin Velasquez is an associate professor of law at the Maurer School of Law in Indiana University, Bloomington. A prestigious legal mind and one of the preeminent thinkers on labor and AI, Alvin has dedicated his career to the labor movement and is now examining the evolving role of unions in the governance of emerging technologies and what it all means for the future of workers. His contributions to the field are profound and his voice is more critical now than ever. But beyond his professional accolades, Alvin is also a longtime friend, someone whose passion for justice and fairness resonates deeply in everything he does. Today, we'll dive into the vital role labor unions play in shaping AI governance, the legal and ethical frameworks needed to protect workers, and how we can navigate this transformative era without leaving anyone behind. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us for an enlightening conversation with Professor Alvin Velasquez. And don't forget to like and subscribe. So, Professor, what are the key legal considerations for labor unions when negotiating AI governance frameworks with employers?
Well, the first is looking into what power does the union have in the first place, and that the power is going to be found in the members and not in labor law per se. Right now, labor law, I think it's arguable as to whether it's artificial bargaining over artificial intelligence governance is a mandatory or permissive subject. I think the first thing they have to do is kind of what I would call a heat check. Do you have the heat that to get this through, even if a employer considers this a permissive subject of bargaining? The other legal consideration, though, is I think that the unions can actually be a interesting thought partner for companies seeking to comply with the law that other states are putting out. Right now, what you have is that California, for example, has stepped into the breach. New York has stepped into a breach in a certain way in terms of regulating artificial intelligence. And even though those laws don't specifically always speak to worker issues, I think they're very much stuck in a consumer framework. I think unions can actually serve as a useful internal watchdog for compliance purposes for companies that are seeking to implement and use artificial intelligence. So rather than run away from run away from artificial intelligence, like the way I look at it is, how can you harness it and use it to benefit your members and also to build power for the union?
Brilliant. And just to go back to how you started this conversation, what type of conversations have you been having about whether AI is a permissive subject of bargaining? Have you heard folks making an argument about discrimination, worker safety, or data privacy, any of those areas so far?
Yeah, so plenty of people have been talking about, I think, racial discrimination, for example, right? I mean, the facial recognition software is a great example of
Yeah.
how artificial intelligence just kind of gets it wrong. I've definitely heard plenty of data privacy considerations in terms of using data to train up AI models. But I think where it's sorely lacking, and kind of where I'm trying to change the conversation, is how then should those rights be vindicated? Because these statutes and laws, of course, provide access to lawsuits, and also lawsuits brought by attorney generals and state offices, but really they're not the ones who are closest to where the abuses happen. It really, in my opinion, really is workers who are the ones who see how AI is used on a day-to-day basis and how it can see its pernicious effects when it's used in a improper way. And so what I realize is that a lot of the laws don't contemplate a place for unions and collective bargaining to regulate artificial intelligence. And that's kind of like the big gaping hole that I see, and where I think unions can be really, and their collective bargaining power can really be a useful intermediary between like what a federal government or state government that's resource constrained can do, and what people who are individually resource constrained can do in terms of enforcing the law.
Interesting. And this makes me think about how traditional collective bargaining applies to the new technology because it evolves so quickly.
Yep.
Can unions bargain collectively over the implementation and use of AI systems in the workplace? This is obviously not settled, but what's your early thoughts on this?
Yeah, so my early thoughts is, if you look at what the screen actors tried to do, they tried to do exactly that. And what ended up happening is you get a deal in which they have some consultation rights, and then they get a lot of downstream effects, meaning they protect workers from the effects of AI, but they're not part of the governance of AI yet. And that's because I imagine, or at least the story I tell myself, is that the employers were not interested in having that conversation, partially because it's a ceding of power. Right. And so the way I looked at it, at the situation, is right now what you get is effects bargaining. But I do wonder if in the right situation where there's real power, you could get AI specifically bargaining concerning the governance of the use of AI and its implementation at the corporate level.
Got it. And I'm really glad you brought up the example of the Writers Guild. That was such a big strike that I'm not sure folks really heard about the outcome, and that they were able to get language in their contract that sort of, it wasn't, the end all be all, but, creating a contract is about step one. And then the next negotiations, you get a little bit further, and it's a collaboration between the employer and the union, and nothing's going to be signed off unless both sides agree. So, this is why your paper is so interesting and important for folks who are watching. Going to put a link to it in the chat, but you really need to read this. It is sort of a really important work for determining what the future is going to look like. Just sort of a first entry point. It's called The Union's Role in Artificial Intelligence Governance and Regulation. And we'll be doing more coverage on this paper as we move along. But another thing I was thinking about was, what role can unions play in shaping the training and usage of, the data used for AI systems to ensure it's representative and unbiased?
Yeah, so I think that's part of where the power dynamics come in. And I think when you look at, for example, the you talked about the screenwriters, right? Like the guild and that strike. What I find interesting is that it's what they were going for was the training data. And so, like noticed in a negotiation, you don't get everything that you want. And reason I kind of focused on the training data is because, to me, training data as affects training out actual outputs. How an artificial intelligence instrument gets trained, for example, for the purposes of hiring people, determines who gets the job. And I wrote a blog post that was called the discrimination we're not talking about, and that was partially in response to the fact that we have been, as a society, talking about racial discrimination and other forms of pernicious discrimination against marginalized communities, but we really haven't talked about how AI discriminates against workers per se, and specifically against unions and union organizing. And basic labor law principles teach that you cannot discriminate against a worker who's applying based on their union sympathies or their past union activity, that's a violation of Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. And so, to me, that's the discrimination we haven't been talking about, that actually covers a lot of people, because most people who are going to be unionized or a part of a union don't have the same power, let's say, as management. And I'm kind of surprised we haven't talked about that. So I see training, and the way I see training data playing out is that, for example, I think about this quote that's in the paper from Ethan Mullick, who's a associate professor at Wharton, who talks about the fact that the training data is, AI is fundamentally capitalist in nature, and primarily European based in nature in terms of the outputs it puts out. And as people who are interested in the trade union movement, that makes you ask, well, are those values of unfettered capitalism always going to protect workers? Because there's always been a tension between the labor movement and capitalism. Not that, I'm not saying socialism or communism. I'm just saying that labor and its power acts as a check on kind of what I would call the free market can do no wrong kind of way of thinking about corporate hegemony and corporate power. It serves as a check, right? No matter what kind of language you use. And so when I think about AI and labor, I thought, well, can labor be a check, and to what extent can it be a check on the unfettered use of AI to kind of obviate some of its potential for pernicious harms?
Right. And a lot of the conversation that's being had is just about, AI taking jobs. Whereas I hear some folks saying, this is about making humans more efficient, increasing your ability to do multiple things. And I don't think anybody would disagree that some AI tools do that. Maybe it makes it easier for you to edit, to write, etc. But then when we think about the Longshoremen Union and the strike there, which is, fair, to be fair, it's more about automation than it's AI. I think people get terms mixed up a bit. Labor should have a huge voice in this conversation, but not just in terms of stopping the technology from progressing, but in sort of, I think, being a buffer to how the technology develops in a humane way. To think that the market will automatically do that by some virtue of the invisible hand, I think that that's a bit naive. What do you think?
I agree, actually, and there's two reasons I think that. I think first of all, there's some work law scholars who have a very positive view of AI, right? They see it especially closing the gender wage gap. I specifically, Orly Lobel has written a lot about that, and I definitely see the potential for that. But I also I wonder if that happens in the absence of a union or countervailing forces on artificial intelligence. Now, I wanted to share something, since you brought up the longshoreman strike, about a class exercise I did, because I think it's actually very illuminating as far as this AI and its logic is concerned. So I had my students in my labor law class break up into two groups to negotiate the longshoreman strike dispute, and specifically automation. I asked them to use artificial intelligence to help them resolve the longshoreman dispute and how to deal with automation. And what was fascinating about it is that the exercise proved two things. So there was plenty of good output. But the first thing that I noticed was the AI told students to be kind to each other and to be really professional toward each other and use good language. And what was ironic about that is I had just taught a couple days prior to that cases in which having to do with picket line kind of not just violence or misconduct, in which the courts were very protective of the heat that can happen on a picket line and the anger and the use of rough language, let's say, and foul language. And so they kind of all chuckled at the fact that it was like, make sure you're nice to each other at all times, because labor law is like kind of developed within conflict at times before you get to an agreement. The other thing that it did, though, is that the guardrails went up immediately, and there was a bit of a cognitive dissonance with the strike. So some people would, like the casebook I was using, put out by my colleague Ken Schmidt here, talks about economic weapons, strikes and boycotts as economic weapons. When you put that in, the guardrails immediately went up. It's like, oh, you do not want to use economic weapons. It's kind of, it would dissuade the students from talking about strikes. It would also fail to contain a power analysis. Like it's asking, for example, every good organizer knows if you're going to go on strike, you need to know how many people are going to walk out. You need to know how strong, is it going to be 90%, 98% of your unit? That looks very different than 30% of your unit walking out. But the AI missed that, and the AI missed the refused to talk about economic weapons. But if you said strike and go on strike, in a just on its own, just saying, hey, are strikes good things, right? Both Claude and ChatGPT were like, oh, strikes can help workers gain better leverage and a better living. And so in the abstract, when you ask this kind of fact pattern that's outside of a concrete dispute, it endorsed the strike, or at least generally was, more in favor of it. But then when you put it in the context of a real dispute between an employer and a union, it was much more skittish. And so it was a very interesting exercise that I think demonstrates some of the wariness that trade unions that are hoping to rely on this should have, and some of the skepticism they should have about it.
Absolutely. It also makes me wonder what Claude and GPT are sourcing for those answers, right? Is it getting case law? Is it getting oral arguments in court? Is it, is it just, is it going to union websites and scraping what they have up there, which probably wouldn't be much? It'd be very interesting to see what balance of, is this coming from employers? Is this coming from unions? Is it coming from, content experts online?
Right.
Maybe something to follow up on.
It's actually coming from everywhere, right? The real issue is not whether the data is out there, because it is. So, for example, some of these things, right, are contained in textbooks that are, online, or that are publicly scrapable. Not just textbooks, but also published papers, right? There's some published papers in journals that specialize on labor affairs that will talk about some of these kind of strategic questions. And like you said, the union websites and then videos of union activity that have been taken over the years. So there's plenty of training data. The real issue is, what weights do you assign to data? And how does that, within the deep learning networks, like how does that get weighed and kind of play against other considerations? And what's fascinating is, right, like when you look at deep learning networks, people aren't exactly clear how they exactly work yet, right? We understand input in and output, but how that then gets mixed into is not, and to produce an output is not completely understood yet. Like there are some mapping exercises, but just kind of like the human brain isn't completely mapped out, how artificial intelligence synthesizes data, right, and inputs is not completely mapped out. So I would say the information is there. There's just a question of weight, and I would argue probably values.
Right, and I think about how the different language models act. People are using Gemini. People are using GPT. They're using all these different models to come up with products. Sometimes they may run it through 2 or 3 AIs and having no idea how any of them actually work, which, I don't know to what degree is necessary to know that, but you're looking for a good output. But it gets pretty interesting when you start seeing some of the things that are produced, whether it be images or music.
Right.
We've been doing AI trainings for union leaders just to get their hands on some of these tools instead of just talking about it in the abstract, like, try this out, like put your hands on it, see what it does. And then we talk about the ethics, which is like, when should you let people know that you're using AI, right? And when should you ban it, or how should you allow it in the workplace? I think that's a battle that seems to already be happening in education, which I'm sure you're already familiar with as a prestigious professor, right? Like, how do it sounds really great that you have your students playing around with it. But then I'm sure there have to be limitations, because there has to be some output that's from them. But I want to actually go back for a second. You said something really interesting, talking about how the use of artificial intelligence could be impacting hiring. And this is an analogy I use with people quite a bit, even in our trainings. When it comes to applying for a job on, let's say, Indeed or one of the other major platforms, and not to beat up on Indeed, because, they're just the biggest right now. But if you go and apply for a job on some of these things like LinkedIn or Indeed, some of them are using artificial intelligence in the back end through the applicant tracking systems to see if they can go through as many applications as possible to filter them out. And then you have applicants using systems with AI to try to get past those ATS systems. So now you have AI talking to AI. You have people putting out hundreds of applications. And I think a lot of people have noted that the hiring process has changed dramatically, not just because of the labor market, but also employment has changed because of the systems that companies are using.
Right.
So the AI being used in hiring and performance evaluation, how do we make sure that they do not perpetuate biases or discriminated against protected groups, which you did mention a little earlier?
Yeah, so it seems to me a couple things. One is that you don't, what I find fascinating right now is that if you look at how companies talk about how they use AI, right? They don't really they're all over the place about how they discuss its use. So, for example, right, a lot of them will focus on cybersecurity issues when they talk about it publicly, but they won't talk about their back end, right? Like the human resources, for example. It's just not deemed relevant to the public. Or they might, if they're a publicly traded company, they might not deem it material because it doesn't have an impact, a significant enough impact that, for example, investors would care about it. It seems to me that we need to have a discussion, excuse me, about how to disclose and what to disclose about AI usage. Because I think there's two angles to look at this, right? The first angle is, for example, because I teach corporate law too. Like, do you require companies to disclose certain information on their quarterly and yearly financial reports and on their proxy? That's one way to attack it. But the other way to attack it is, okay, well, what information do we have the AI companies and generators, your open AI sorts, put out regarding usage? Because they're tracking usage as well. And I think that this information shouldn't matter just to like the investing community. It also actually matters to government regulators, especially when you talk about jobs. And here's why. If I'm a government, let's take a state that's been really that could be really hard hit by the use of AI technology, that has a significant knowledge base. Washington, well, I was going to say DC, it's not a state, but Washington DC has lots of people whose business is creating content. Think tanks, for example, putting out research papers, policy papers going out by government agencies. AI could be used to write our rules. AI could be used to write out our, first drafts, right, of a notice and comment and rulemaking, a proposed rule, to say, hey, I want to change the rule for, how the non-compete rule, for example, the FTC put. Somebody could say, let's think of an alternative that is much less protective of workers and much more protective of business interest. Get rid of a lot of people that way if you pass that law. Now, it seems to me, though, that if you're getting rid of people, right, if companies are getting rid of people, they're imposing externalities on society. People who are not without jobs are they need unemployment insurance, might need to look for alternative health care that sometimes is state provided. If I'm a government, I would want to know what the spillover effects of artificial intelligence on the workforce is. And I'd want to figure out how to get that disclosed. And so I actually think the disclosure of this kind of information is not just of interest to businesses, but it also should be of interest to regulators, and then also, honestly, policymakers who are concerned about how do I deal with the shock that could come from AI job loss. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that was actually a great answer. I mean, this is something that people talk a lot about, which is the loss of jobs because of AI. I don't think they think about it from an administrative perspective. But that leads to my next question, which is, if AI leads to job displacement, what legal obligations do employers have to their workers? And how can unions advocate for retaining and redeployment opportunities?
Right. So I think the first thing we got to remember is, because we're in the United States, I find something very interesting, which is that the EU is much more protective of the employment relationship than we are here. And so the EU AI Act it has some protections around the workplace, not as much as I'd like. It's actually, the protections are mainly in the GDPR. But when I think about the US context, I think about the fact that we're an at-will country. And with the exception of Puerto Rico and Montana, which allow for firings only for cause, most are at will. You don't really get a huge bundle of rights when you're fired. You don't have workers don't have notice obligations. They can be let go without notice. The only exception to that is the WARN Act, which requires a disclosure when there's a massive layoff that's about to happen. If you think about it under the same idea that I just told you about with AI, which is if a bunch of people are about to become are not going to are going to lose their jobs, then in that case the state will want warning, one for the benefit of the workers, but two for the benefit of its own insurance systems as well. I think because of how our country's employment laws are shaped, you get very few as a worker protections against AI.
Right. And in that context, can unions negotiate for worker control or oversight over AI systems that directly impact their work, such as scheduling algorithms or automated performance monitoring tools?
I think they'd have to. I almost think if you're somebody who's at the table, you'd almost have to ask that. Whether you get it or not, it's a whole different story. That goes to the give and take of the market. But I do think that like state regulators and federal regulators can kind of support and push parties in the direction of negotiating over AI, right? I think that one of the things for that is to figure out how unions can be part, and this is one of the ideas I was hoping my paper would spur, is how can unions work with state regulators? Yes, state law regulators are preempted, for example, from a collective bargaining law right now. But can those regulators give a privileged pace for unions in their AI enforcement? I think the tricky thing with AI and just with our privacy law in the United States generally is that it's very consumer focused. And yes, we've talked about workers, but the kind of protections that a state can give to workers is a kind of de minimis in comparison to what a union, especially that's really powerful, can do in terms of bargaining for issues having to do with governance. Governance really is about control, and that gets into the management union dynamics and conflicts that many of us are familiar with.
Given your experience as an important, attorney in the union world, do you see more of a pace of, or let's just say more of a swing of unions thinking about going against the use of AI, or potentially thinking about how to leverage it to protect workers? What are you sensing?
So obviously, I mean, I made the transition out of practice, right, into being an academic, but it seems to me that right now there really is a question for unions about like what kind of resources to invest into thinking about AI with all of the challenges that they're facing otherwise, especially in an incoming Trump administration, when they're thinking literally about their very survival. It seems to me that a lot of people have accepted the premise that AI is here to stay, but either it doesn't affect me, or there's other groups that can advocate for the same kind of interest that I have. And to be honest, from an institutional capacity perspective, I don't think that, for example, having a few nonprofits can do the work. Now, I think there's also some in the union world. I read a couple of reports recently that argue that unions don't have the capacity to scale up right now to be kind of a useful buffer between the kind of pessimism of the robots are all going to take our jobs and the optimism of, hey, this is going to bring like better equality amongst people, right? As far as the workplace is concerned. I somewhat disagree with that. I think the reason for that is that I think unions can institutionally do so. However, they have to be allowed to do so. And in this regard, I think about how, for example, the federal government has done partnerships with unions through OSHA. Right? OSHA as an agency can't be at every single workplace to do every single thing. It relies on unions and workers on the ground to be their eyes and ears. And in that way, I actually think that unions can do that, can be the eyes and ears of AI safety and AI governance if allowed to do so, and frankly, do it a lot cheaper than spending a ton of money on another government agency, which I would think would appeal to those who are fiscally conservative and concerned about the size of their state or federal fisc.
Very true. So how can unions leverage existing labor laws such as OSHA regulations to ensure worker safety?
Yeah, so I think you earlier mentioned a bit about like workplace safety, and it's clear that AI impacts worker safety, and from that perspective, that gives unions a hook to which to engage in bargaining. And actually, I would argue that that is a traditional subject of bargaining. You're talking about workplace conditions, specifically workplace safety. I think that squarely lands into the traditional hours, wages, and working conditions of employment that is part of mandatory subjects of bargaining versus permissive. I think that comes to constructing a bargaining plan that incorporates asking about AI and getting it to the table. Whether a union is going to use their bargaining leverage for that versus something else is obviously an internal question for the unions to look at. I would argue, given the prevalence of artificial intelligence in the workplace and the fact that it can impact not just back office operations, but also front end stuff that drives the profit of an enterprise, that unions would want to, at the very least, do what the Screen Actors and Writers Guild did, which is kind of take benefit from the downstream effects of AI, meaning the product, and then putting in some at least minor guardrails, even if you can't get to governance. However, I think the vision I was trying to cast in this paper was, hey, unions could do so much more. Not just bargaining in terms of, like let's say what crumbs are coming off the table or what value is being produced, but governing how it's fixed. And I think that the controversial part of this paper is it says unions should have this benefit, and then there's some responsibilities that should come with that as well. Right, meaning that if for example a union abused that kind of power or that kind of responsibility, that they could be held liable as well for engaging with something improper with the employer. And I don't think that's that controversial, because if we already have rules, for example, that forbid unions and bargainers from taking things of value from employers, right? Like a union bargainer, for example, the classic scenario, if UAW and Ford are negotiating, the lead bargainer doesn't get a free car from Ford, right? That is a problem, because that undermines the integrity of the union and collective bargaining process. So my suggestion that says unions should be given this responsibility, this power, but also this responsibility, I think serves as an effective counterweight for people who are concerned that unions could abuse whatever power they would get under my proposal.
Very interesting. And this brings me to my last question. You
Sure.
really made me think about bargaining for the common good when you said that. What is this sort of societal contribution that unions can make by negotiating really good collective bargaining agreements that are sort of balanced and thoughtful, not just saying no, but also not just saying yes, right? And we might bring someone from bargaining for the common good on the show at some point. But what role can unions play in shaping the training data used for AI systems to ensure that not just, as I said before, it's representative and unbiased, but also that it takes worker interest into account?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and it really is about how that data is weighed, especially if you're creating a custom GPT. So, for example, if a company is going to spend the resources on creating its own AI trained on its own data for its own purposes, unions could talk about how the weights that are assigned to data that is pro-worker, for example, could be assigned a higher weight than other types of data, right? And that it's actually a great way for companies that claim that they are either progressive or pro-worker to actually put that into action, right, in a very concrete way. And I think the benefit that has for that is, especially once that training data, it stops being proprietary, and like that tool, if that tool becomes public, that puts out into the public sphere, product or work product that is not weighed, or that has different weights assigned to it that are more pro worker, that also can, geez, I'm fumbling here right now, can support, let's say, a broader vision of justice. And I think that's really where the bargaining for the common good angle comes in. The way I see it is that unions are typically seen as, okay, you're only going to protect your own interest. And there's, of course, when your interests are aligned with the employer for the long term in terms of keeping the employer alive, there's some truth to that. But they also are in this weird tension with their employer as well. And I see that tension for workers as being something that will lead them to bargain around AI in a way that will produce language that can be replicated in other companies.
Brilliant. And this conversation is going to continue to develop, but you are one of the leading, I think, thinkers in this space. And folks, both in the labor movement and the AI space who are watching this, have plenty to think about. I'm going to put a link to all of your writing down at the bottom of this video. And I would love to have you come back and talk about more. Alvin Velasquez, Associate Professor of Law at the Maurer School of Law at Indiana University, Bloomington. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.